And then before I introduce you and hand it over to our facilitators for today, just a reminder that this is part one of our two-part series on navigating change through fair access. So for those who don't know, Fair Access is a statewide initiative delivered by the Office of Women in Sport and also in partnership with Sport and Recreation Victoria as well as Vic Health. So fair access is intended to ensure that women, girls and gender diverse people can fully access and participate in the benefits of community sport. So all Victorian councils are now required to have a fair access policy and action plan in place. And as a result, council and clubs will need to demonstrate that they are enacting fair access in order to remain eligible for future community infrastructure funding via the state government. As part of Council's allocation and agreement process, clubs will be asked to have an action plan ready come July 1 in 2025. And that's essentially why we're here today, to support you all and to make you understand and appreciate the impact of developing an action plan for your particular club. From this two-part series, you'll hear from our subject matter expert today and receive a host of resources, tips and templates to help your club to develop the action plan. So without further ado, today we're lucky to have April, who's representing MK Consulting, to facilitate our navigating change through fair access. So yeah, over to you, April, to introduce yourself and outline today's session.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jackson, for the brief introduction and for getting us underway today. We're going to do our best to keep to time, acknowledging that this is most likely lunch break time for a lot of the people joining us on the call today. So I'll introduce myself briefly. My name's April Wilson. I use she, her pronouns. Have worked in the sports industry for a long time. So my background is in exercise and sports science at an academic level, but have worked in areas of coaching, club development and management for a long time, over the last 2 decades, and also 4 years working in the local government sector. Currently working over at Nillumbik Shire Council, so not too far away from you, and specifically in the area of gender equity and prevention of family violence. And also experienced as a coach myself. So I'm a gymnastics coach with the YMCA and have run a gymnastics club for about 7 years. So all sort of facets of having been an athlete myself, a coach, an administrator, an official, and hopefully I can utilize that experience to walk you through fair access today and my take on it, and bring you along for that journey as well. So we'll get underway and jump over to the next slide. And I'll outline what we're doing today. I think this is always really important. If you're like me, you like to know what's ahead of you in terms of an educational workshop. Mostly I like to know that there's no role plays coming up. So there are no role plays as part of this workshop today. There is a lot of listening, but also opportunity to be interactive and ask questions. Please use that chat function or pop up your hand using the raise function. Happy for you to jump in at any stage. Feel free to interrupt me as we go. So we're going to have a bit of a chat around the principles of gender equity and how those apply in a sport-specific context. I don't want to assume any knowledge, so we will take it back to basics at the very beginning of the workshop, and then we'll get into some more nitty-gritty specific examples and details as we go along, and also give you a bit of a rundown on what the fair access policy looks like and how it's applicable to your club. We'll talk about your role specifically as a committee member or as a coach or whatever role you're representing your club in today. I'll get you to take a moment as well when you get a second just to pop your name into the chat, what your role is and which club you're representing today, so we've got a bit of a sense of who's in the room. Of course, with leadership comes navigating cultural change, and that's something that can be really challenging. It can also involve resistance and backlash to the change that you're trying to enact. So in anticipating that, we're going to talk about different types of resistance and backlash that you might face when we're navigating through this change, particularly over the next 12 months, and how you might respond to that and be prepared for that. And we'll get you underway with thinking about how we might approach an action plan that is tailored to your club. We won't be completing an action plan today. That's a little bit too ambitious for 90 minutes, but it will give you a bit of a sense of how we're going to get started, so it doesn't feel like such a full-on immeasurable task. It's going to be something that we break down into little steps and make sure it's right and tailored to your club. Okay, a lot to tackle in the next 90 minutes. A couple of ground rules before we get started. When we're talking about any topic that is with regards to inclusion and equity, we do need to respect that it can be a sensitive topic depending on the lived experience of the people in the room. So I encourage you to listen with curiosity, to respect one another's views as they may differ, and also, understand that people are coming from different perspectives with different lived experience, and withhold judgment, just being open to taking on board new information. If you do want to share any examples as well with the group today, I encourage that, but I would ask you to just de-identify any personal examples that you might share from your sporting club or from your experience. City of Yarra is not a huge space geographically, so it's possible that you might be able to identify someone based on the club that they attend. So we'll make sure that we're protecting people's privacy in that sense. There are no silly questions. Please feel free to ask any questions. Don't worry about it being politically correct or not. Sometimes that holds people back from asking really important questions and seeking clarification. So I do encourage you to ask any burning questions you might have. And it's okay to not know any answers or to be inarticulate in communicating your questions. I'm certainly not a holder of all the answers myself, and I'm also currently about 11 weeks postpartum. So I will certainly be inarticulate at points as I struggle to string sentences together with a bit of baby brain, and that's okay as well. We're just going to do the best we can. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are going to start right at the start, not assuming any knowledge here. Talking about some of the terms that we're going to be utilising throughout the workshop to make sure that we're all on the same page. And the big one to make sure we have clear from the very start is the difference between sex and gender, because we have these two terms that we seem to use interchangeably all the time, but they do mean different things and they have different definitions. If you were to Google them or look them up in a dictionary, you would see that although we use them interchangeably, they're quite different. So when we're talking about sex, we're talking about the physical, the biology and physiology of a person's being, thinking about things like their genitals, their chromosomes, and their hormones. Whereas gender is something that we mold and shape and define as a society. It's a social construct, a person's sense of who they are, but also what society deems as being something that might be considered feminine or masculine. And the reason we know that that's a construct and not something concrete is because it changes over time. And so a really simple example of that is high-heeled shoes, which is something that in the current day and age we consider to be quite a feminine thing. We've assigned that to femininity, but high-heeled shoes were originally designed to be worn by men. So it is something that can evolve and shift and change. You might also hear terms like healthy masculinity versus toxic masculinity, and that's because there are sets of roles and behaviors and attitudes and attributes that we assign, we put into categories as being feminine or masculine. So if you have used these terms interchangeably before, you're not the first person who has. I certainly have mistakenly as well. They are different. And the main takeaway I want you to get from that is that when we're talking about sex, think about the medical side of things, the physical side of things. We're talking about gender, we're talking about a sense of identity. And that can be very flexible, very grey, very fluid. You might have also heard the term non-binary or gender diverse, binary meaning two, and in this case, we're talking about female and male or femininity or masculinity. So non-binary means somebody that doesn't identify with either of those gender norms. And you'll also hear the term gender diverse, which means the same thing. So that's another thing that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about this workshop, is that the fair access policy specifically refers to women and girls, but I also want you to be thinking about the needs and access for the gender diverse community as well. We're going to try as much as possible to stay away from that very rigid binary definition of what gender is. And finally, we have an acronym that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, or at least have heard or read in passing, which is LGBTQIA+. Can be a little bit of a mouthful, but it's an acronym, and it stands for lesbian, gay, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, and asexual. And the plus at the end is representative of the fact that there is lots of different combinations of sexuality and gender identity that may not fit neatly into any of those previous letters. So um, if you're someone who struggles with the acronym and with saying it, you're not the only person either. In you talking to your committees or talking to your peers or colleagues at your club, you might refer to this as the rainbow community. That's quite acceptable too. And you might also hear people refer to the queer community, and that is an interesting one because queer, the word queer, was probably previously perceived as being quite a derogatory term. Certainly a good 40, 50 years ago, it was used in a derogatory way, and it's being reclaimed by a younger generation with a sense of pride. And so you'll probably hear it more often now at your clubs or in your community as well. I think the great thing about working with you at City of Yarra is that City of Yarra has an impeccable reputation amongst local government areas for being a progressive area that is really welcoming and inclusive of the LGBTI community. So if that's you and your club and you know that that's something that you're already across, then I think that's something to be really proud of. Can move to the next slide. Another really important one for us to get down first before we launch into the workshop today is the difference between equity and equality. And you've probably seen this diagram or something similar. You might have seen the one with the people standing on boxes peering over into a baseball field. That's a very common one as well. And it's describing the difference between these two terms. So we're going to keep it pretty simple. We are talking about gender today, but in terms of a broad definition of equality versus equity, equality is where a group of people or a person is given the same resources or opportunities, whereas equity, each person or the group of people are given what they need for that particular set of circumstances. So how I would explain it to my athletes, if I was working with a young group of athletes, is one of my athletes has a broken leg. Knock on wood, we don't want to see that. And another athlete has a cut on their finger. If I was to provide both of those athletes with a Band-Aid, that would be what we would call an equality approach. So I would be giving them both the same thing. And in that sense, some people might describe that as fair. They're being given the same resource for what we've got. But as you can imagine, that Band-Aid is going to be helpful for the person with a cut on their finger and not particularly helpful for the person whose leg is broken. And so giving the person who has a broken leg an x-ray and probably a cast and maybe a wheelchair and some crutches to get around, and giving the person with a cut on their finger a Band-Aid is what we would call an equitable approach. So giving each person exactly what they need for their own specific set of circumstances. And we see examples of this all the time in our society. For example, students in high school, you might remember yourself, or you might be aware if you've got children of that age, that if you have a learning disability, for example, that you might receive additional time to complete an assignment or to do an exam. Another example of an equitable approach, where not everyone is given the same thing, but everyone is given what they need in order to be set up for success. Same goes with things like our federal government and Centrelink being able to access funds depending on your individual circumstances to provide you with that additional support is based on an equitable approach. So when we're talking about fair access, equality is the end goal. Everyone being on the same level, same page. But how we get there is through an equitable approach. And so when we're talking about sport, we know that historically women and girls and also gender diverse people in the LGBTI community have been at a disadvantage due to policies and pathways that have not been particularly accessible. And so what this policy is aiming to do is to try to balance out that situation by providing additional support through the fair access policy to eventually achieve a sporting community and a sporting environment and industry in this country where everyone has the same and everyone is equal. Moving on to the next slide. So the last important term I want to mention today is intersectionality, and this is maybe one that's less commonly spoken about, but it's really important as well. Intersectionality is referring to all of the different aspects or elements of your identity. So if you're reflecting on yourself and your own identity, you might say that you identify as someone who is female. You might be someone who identifies as a mother or a daughter. You might identify as a person who is Australian, or maybe you're someone who is a migrant from overseas. Maybe you identify as someone who has a mental illness or experiences disability. And any number of those things can be true and be held to be true at the same time. So when we talk about intersectionality, we talk about how people's identities are multifaceted and diverse, and how all of those different parts of your identity can compound and overlap and shape your experience of the world. And in a lot of cases can also shape and experience the probability or likelihood that you experience discrimination or harassment. So when we see someone who has a very diverse identity in a number of these different ways, they might be sexually diverse, they might have an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander background, have a disability or a mental illness. When we have a lot of those factors into play, a person might also be more at risk of experiencing discrimination, harassment, or marginalisation. So this is really important to consider with fair access, because we're going to talk a lot about women and girls, but I want to remind you that we don't all fit neatly into the box of women and girls, that we have multifaceted identities. And so when you enact your action plan and you look at evaluating success at the end of the day, what we want to see is people that are reflective of our entire community. And I would argue that if you're very successful at engaging a particular cohort of women and girls, maybe Caucasian girls of an Australian background at your cricket or football or soccer club, but you don't have any person who maybe experiences a disability or is from a culturally diverse background, that there's probably still a little bit of work to do to increase access for people who have a greater intersectionality in terms of their identity. Okay, so very, very broad terms, very broad definitions that we've gone through there. And please feel free to pop any questions you might have in the chat. And thank you for everyone so far who has popped in where they're representing and what their role is. We can see we've got some presidents, secretaries, directors. Yep, fantastic. Amazing. Let's get into the nitty gritty of what gender inequality looks like specifically in sport. So these are some examples that I'm sharing with you from a professional sporting context. It is going to look different at a community level, which is what you're representing today. But some examples just to get us thinking, get our brains moving. We've got in the top corner here an inequality in prize money. Two people competing in surfing competition, it looks like. We've got the under 18s women and the under 18s men winners, but we've got half the prize money there for the woman who has won in her category. We've got a headline here, albeit a very dated headline, but we've got Phelps tying for silver in the 100 fly for swimming. But objectively, we've got we've got objectively a more sizable achievement in Ledecky setting a world record, but it's the smaller headline. And then finally, we've got here, a wife of a Bears lineman wins a bronze medal today in the Rio Olympics. So we've got an athlete who has achieved something very notable in terms of their placing at the Olympics, but we can see that they've been defined as the wife of another athlete rather than acknowledged in their own right. So a couple of examples there to get you thinking about what it looks like in a sporting context, and that's at a professional level. But what I'm interested in getting your input to, and feel free to take yourself off the chat, raise your hand, or use the chat function. What do you think a gender unequal context looks like in a community sports setting? So maybe something that you've noticed at your club, or maybe through an experience of a child or your own experience as an athlete, perhaps at a community level. So I'm going to stop myself from talking for a couple of minutes and just give you a second to have a think. Feel free to pop any ideas you have in the chat of what that inequality might look like in a community setting. Yeah, I've got Joji with hand up there. If you want to take yourself off mute, jump in.
Sure. Simple one, or not simple, but an example of one that happened just in our committee. We were organising an event, so a running race, and basically had it split into the binary divisions of men and women races. But in the committee, just one of the members talking about, we've got to have the main event as the men's event going last. That's the important one, and those types of just comments that it's the kind of thing that was put down at the end, because we actually had sort of some superstars in the women's event, but just framed in that way just made people think about something being the main event. Just that language in and of itself was sort of coming up, and it's like, it's not really. It's not the way to frame that event. It's just an example that we came across.
That's a perfect example. Thank you so much for sharing that. Really, really clear example. And I would say also probably has happened for a very long time in AFL. When we look at the fixtures for Saturdays and Sundays, is that Saturday afternoon is considered prime time, and that's always the senior men's game, and women and juniors on a Sunday. So another perfect example. Let's have a look at what we've got. We've got a few answers coming in the chat as well. Ben has shared mixed sides where one sex is getting more time than another. Yep, great example. Other examples might be, better access to grounds, facilities and equipment, lower quality facilities, less convenient practice times, fewer opportunities to compete. Yeah, these are all perfect examples of what it might look like in a community setting. So things like uniforms being designed for the male body, but everyone provided with the same, or is another example. You've already mentioned here access to equipment. So in some cases, we've seen the women's team or the girls' team just inherit equipment that was previously used by the men's team rather than receive their own. Access to main grounds, or fixtures being completed where the women and girls team is an afterthought and only completed once the men's team has been fixtured onto their preferred schedule. And it looks like Therese is coming in with one more example for us as well. These are great examples. And we might jump over to the next slide while we're getting that last example from Therese coming through. So that really, absolutely, recognition and rewards. Yep, absolutely. Even at a community level, that's very, very true. Okay, and then that leads us beautifully into this slide to look at what did the stats say? What have we got in terms of data and research that lets us know what that inequality looks like in terms of a quantitative amount? So we know that participation is higher for males in sport. Vic Health completes community participation data every couple of years. This was post-COVID data, so we actually know that post-COVID, the participation rates for men recovered much more strongly than they did for women in terms of all ages and their participation in sport. We know that roughly half of people who participate in community sport will witness sexist language or jokes that make them uncomfortable. Women are more likely to feel unwelcome at their sporting club, and unfortunately, when we're talking about the LGBTI community, 80% of individuals will have witnessed or experienced homophobia on the sports field. So I do want to acknowledge as well that this data that we have here is quite binary in nature. Unfortunately, there is not nearly as much research available when it comes to the experiences of gender diverse people in community sport. That is being rectified, and there's more research coming out all of the time, but a lot of the research that we have from previous years is quite binary. So I do want to acknowledge that. Some of the other statistics that have come from the Office for Women in Sport are that men are more likely to feel that things are equal, whereas the perception from women is that there isn't equal access to community sporting facilities at peak times. Leaving sport, one of the main reasons for leaving sport for women is due to inequitable treatment, and parents of boys were significantly more likely to say that their son had elite athletes as role models compared to parents of girls, which I think is an interesting one as well. The good news is that things are changing all of the time, and as recently as September this year, we've seen a big shift in terms of the federal approach. Victoria's been doing this for quite a long time. You might have heard of our Balance the Boards initiative, where we see for those state sporting associations who rely on funding from the state government, they need to have 40% split in terms of gender on their boards. This has just been applied at a federal level with the National Gender Equity in Sports Governance Policy, which was announced in September this year. So this brings everyone into line at that state and national sporting organisation level, all the state and territory governments on board, and they've actually increased that quota to 50%. So 50% of all board directors, of chairs, and of subcommittee members are women and or gender diverse people, to be achieved by the 1st of July 2027. So although that may not directly impact you at a community level for a number of years, I think it's important to note that this is happening at a state and a federal level. And we should see that trickle down effect, hopefully, to a community level in the coming years as well. Okay, so let's get stuck into what the Fair Access Policy actually is and what it involves. So there are 6 principles of the Fair Access Policy, and we're going to step through them now. This is what creates a framework for the policy and also what will create a framework for your action plan. So the first principle is that community sport infrastructure and environments are genuinely welcoming, safe and inclusive for women and girls. And I would add here as well, gender diverse people. So when we think about that, what I want you to think about is how you could measure that and whether you actually have a sense of that at the moment at your sporting club. So how do you measure and evaluate whether your club is welcome, safe and inclusive? That might be through observations of your committee members, but it could also be an opportunity to tap into the athletes, the participants, the officials at your club and to get some kind of objective measure, whether that be through a survey or an interview process, as to how you can quantify how welcoming, safe and inclusive you are. That's going to be really important to see whether you are tracking well, making improvements as you start to implement your action plan. Women and girls can fully participate in all aspects of the community sport and recreation setting, and that includes as a player, as a coach or official, administrator, volunteer or spectator. So a good way to think about that is if somebody walked up to you at your club and asked to be any one of those things, what would your first instinct be? Do you have a really clear pathway to support them to get to their goal of whatever it is that they see themselves as being? Or would you likely run into issues, barriers, problems? Would it be a bit tricky? Is it possible that no one has done that before? So that's one to think about as well. Women and girls having equitable access to and use of community sport infrastructure is the third policy. And that relates to everything that we have mentioned in some of those previous examples around access to grounds, facilities, equipment, things like change rooms, bathrooms, fixtures, scheduling of games, competition, training, all of those things we need to have a look at in terms of the third principle. Continued on the next slide are our last 3 principles. Women and girls are equitably represented in leadership and governance roles. So note that that says equitably and not equally. So it doesn't mean that through this policy your club needs to have a 50-50 split. That's not what's being enacted at this time. But it is ensuring that you have representation at that leadership level in governance roles. And also thinking about what those roles look like. So we do unfortunately see where we've got very outdated gender stereotypes and gender roles in some sporting clubs, that we will always have a male president and maybe those women who are part of the committee are in gender stereotypical roles as the secretary or maybe organising the canteen or organising uniforms. So it's also thinking about diversity and opportunities for representation within those roles as well and how we can change things up. encourage and supporting all user groups who access and use the infrastructure to understand, adopt, and implement gender equitable access. So this is where you might sublet or sublease, depending on your agreement with council and the sport you have. If you have a user group that utilises your space, taking them along on this journey with you and making them aware of your action plan and what you're trying to achieve. And also prioritising the use and support of all user groups who demonstrate an ongoing commitment to gender equity. This is one that relates and pertains more to council, and through council's current policies, they will be prioritising the sporting clubs that have their fair access policies and action plans in place, which is why we're here in this education series. So when we're thinking about those last two principles, 5 and 6, I also want you to be thinking about maybe people who utilise your facility outside of the times that you're using it. So for those of you that maybe utilise a sporting ground like an oval, thinking about people who might use it for walking their dogs or who are using it for exercise, and what that looks like to create a safe and inclusive environment for women and girls. Again, more so the responsibility of council than yourself. But there have been some terrific examples of sporting clubs that, for example, have left their lights on for an extra hour during winter in the time where it's dark from 5 o'clock onwards, so that women and girls feel safe to come down and walk laps of the oval after work when they would previously not have been able to exercise because they felt unsafe going out after dark. So thinking outside the box with some of those things is fantastic and encouraged as well. Thanks, Jackson. So this isn't anything new or particularly innovative, but I do want to introduce you to a SWOT analysis, which is not something that we'll complete today. It's not particularly interactive to do online, but it is something that I want you to be aware of because we'll utilize this model for designing our action plans, and is maybe a little bit of homework that you can take away for your next committee meeting to even just set aside 5 or 10 minutes to have a bit of a look at this chart and see if you can jot down a few dot points for each. So a SWOT analysis is where we look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when we're thinking about strengths and weaknesses, we tend to think about things internally that we can control as a club or as a committee. Whereas when we look at opportunities and threats, we're thinking about external factors, just to clarify. So these are the things I want you to be thinking about when you look at your fair access policy, because identifying these is going to help you design your actions. Your strength would be something that you're already doing really well that supports the participation of women and girls and gender diverse people. So that might be that you have a really, really good diversity on your committee, and that's a strength. A weakness is something that you're currently doing which may not be supportive of participation. So if we look at the example that Joji shared before, it might be that you are a bit stuck in your scheduling, that the men's event at your club, in whatever sport it is that you are a part of, is always considered the main event, and it's traditionally been that way and has been upheld for a long amount of time and isn't looking like it's changing anytime soon. So we know that that's a weakness, and we know that's something we need to work on. An opportunity that might exist to support participation. So you might find that externally, you don't have a strong diversity of your committee members, and there's an opportunity there to maybe encourage some people who have, let's say, children at a junior club, parents, to come onto the committee, and we're going to specifically try to target women into those roles. It's an opportunity that might exist for you to create better access at your club. And threats are things that might stand in your way of progress. So when you have your action plan, thinking about, okay, what might stop us here? What might be something that we stumble over? What might be something that stands in our way? And oftentimes that is that coincides with resistance and backlash that you might experience from internally as well, existing people or ideas that are within your club, and that's something we'll talk about too. So thinking a little bit more specifically about your role as a leader, what does that entitle? I know we've got lots of different roles that people are representing today in their clubs, and it's interesting to unpack that and think about how you're going to role model and roll this policy out. So as a leader at your club, you have a responsibility to be informed about the fair access policy and be able to answer questions that your coaches, your players, your officials, your fellow committee members might have. So if you haven't yet, this is a great time to set aside to go through and read the policy. Mostly there is a template that's been endorsed by the Office for Women in Sport that is a standard. Councils have taken that, in some cases made some small adaptations that are specific to their local government area, and then that has been endorsed either by the CEO or by councillors. If you haven't read it yet, please take the time to do that. They're not particularly lengthy policies, and you're not required as a club to design your own policy. You just need to align with the policy that council has endorsed. So take the time to be informed so that you're ready to answer those questions and feel confident in answering those questions. Role model the behaviours and the culture that you expect from others. Culture comes from the top, cultural change comes from the top. And so for those of you that are involved at that committee level, it's going to be really important for you as leadership to role model exactly what you're hoping to see, all the way down to that grassroots participation level, to your youngest junior player all the way back up to your oldest committee member. If you do identify as male, it's important to be an active ally to women, girls, and the gender diverse community. And when we talk about being an active ally, it means being purposeful in the way that you are trying to progress this work, not assuming that people know where you stand when it comes to gender equality or inequality, being vocal and being that active supporter to the women and the girls and the gender diverse people in your community more broadly, and also at your sporting club. And sometimes what that active allyship looks like is stepping back and creating space at the table. So when we talk about at the table, we talk about any setting where there is decision making happening that affects a particular cohort of people. And creating space means stepping back if you're not a part of that cohort where a decision is being made about you, and allowing someone who is a part of that cohort to step forward and share their lived experience and their opinion and their perspective. So this has not been a new concept. In fact, this is a concept that's been used for a long time, particularly in the disability community, of make no decisions about me without me. And it's about giving people agency over decisions that impact them. So you might not always be the right person to make that decision, even if you are the most senior or authorised person in the committee. If you're making a decision about women and girls and you don't have any women or girls on your committee, I would encourage you to invite people to the table that need to have a say in that decision making, whether that be a spectator, a parent, a coach, a player themselves. There's nothing wrong with bringing someone into your committee meeting that can provide you with that lived experience. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, being prepared to manage resistance and backlash. Resistance and backlash in this work is a matter of when, not if. You will face some resistance and there will be backlash potentially at times as well. And so it's better not to be disillusioned about that, and really think about what some of those questions are going to be, so that you can be prepared in how you're going to answer them. You're not going to be able to be prepared every single time. You'll still be caught off guard at times with potentially attitudes or opinions that are expressed. And those are the situations where you find yourself at the end of the day, maybe having a shower and thinking, oh, I wish I'd just said this in the moment. But we're going to do our best to think about what some of those objections might be and be prepared for answers. Thanks, Jackson. So before we dive into looking at that resistance and backlash and what it looks like and how we can prepare for it, I think this is a really good case study to have a look at. And again, another potential activity for you to raise at your next committee meeting, maybe between now and when we do our action planning in person. I'm not sharing this as a case study in terms of shaming this football club. I actually think this is a really great case study to demonstrate leadership in this space. But for those who aren't aware, quite a number of months ago during the winter season for AFL, there was an incident at the Knox Football Club. It was during a domestic violence awareness round that was occurring both at the AFL level and also at a community football level. And what we saw was the men's team had played in the morning and the women's team was scheduled to play in the afternoon. The men had stuck around following their game. And as the women ran out onto the field for their game, the men were vocally rating them as they ran out onto the ground. And also some were trying to trip those players over. As you can see from the headlines that we've got displayed on the screen here, it was obviously condemned by the community pretty quickly. It was a pretty awful thing to have occurred. But what was really interesting was seeing what the club was going to do about it. And I absolutely commend the Knox Football Club and also the league that they're a part of, the Eastern League, for their actions, because there was a lot of pressure on them to make a decision as to how they were going to tackle the behaviour of these male players pretty quickly. So the response is that the entire team was stood down for their behaviour. Don't think I've ever heard of that happening before, but they were not permitted to play until the committees of the club and the league had an opportunity to reflect on this behaviour and decide what they were going to do about it. So they were all suspended from play. And what they introduced next was an education approach. So every single player at that club, whether they were there on the day and participated in this behaviour or not, we're required to undertake mandatory education and participate in mandatory education on gender equity and prevention of domestic and family violence. I think that was really important and really a powerful statement and stance for the club to take in terms of stating their values, condemning this behaviour and showing that as a club, it's not a behaviour that they accept, and that anyone who's not willing to participate in that education and have a look at their attitude is no longer a part of that club. So it became a no education, no play rule. And everyone who has continued on in that club has now completed that education. So the reason I bring up this case study is that this is not something that the Knox Football Club would have anticipated happening. It's quite outrageous behaviour, in my opinion. And so it's a good case study to have a think about, well, if this happened at my club, if there was outwardly sexist behaviour at my club, what would our committee do about it? And are we prepared for that? Do we have a policy in place? Does this fit into our policies around inclusion or around discipline or complaint handling, member protection? Have we considered this type of thing? And it's a really good conversation to have a look at this as a case study. Thanks, Jackson. Okay, so resistance and backlash, another two words that are used interchangeably a lot, but they also do mean different things, or rather they're on a spectrum, I would say. Resistance, I would describe as being more passive, whereas backlash is something that is more aggressive in nature, but we'll get to that point. There are lots of reasons why people are resistant to change. As human beings, we are hardwired to resist change. We love status quo, and often the people who are most resistant to change are the ones who are benefiting from that status quo in some way. So there can be lots of different reasons behind people's resistance. It can be a lack of understanding. It can be change fatigue. So, for example, I mean, we've come out of COVID lockdowns over the last couple of years, and that would have been a really challenging time to introduce a cultural change of this level, because people were so fatigued with constantly changing conditions and rules. That can really play a big factor, a big role in how receptive people are to something that you're trying to change. Cultural and social norms make it really challenging, particularly in the area of gender equity. And it's so important that we have that consistency across multiple settings in our society. It can be really, really challenging, for example, for our local primary schools and secondary schools who are trying to embed respect for relationships education with our young people, for them to then go to their local football club or soccer club, for example, and have those conversations around respect for relationships not reinforced by coaches or by older people at that club. So having consistency in those norms is very important. And fear is another reason why people are resistant to change, that they're fearful that the change will be something that puts them in a position that makes them feel uncomfortable or perhaps doesn't benefit them the way that the status quo currently does. But if you're someone who doesn't like confrontation, and I'm sorry to say that there will be some variation of confrontation in enacting this change, I would encourage you just to maybe take a little twist on your mindset when it comes to confrontation and look at it rather than being something unpleasant or something uncomfortable that has to be tolerated as a sign that you're on the right track. Working in the gender equity space, we know that resistance and backlash often means that we are on the right track, that we are getting people out of their comfort zones and talking about some of the things that have been around for a long time and maybe need to be challenged or looked at differently. It's common, it's to be expected, it's manageable, but you will have people at your club sit somewhere along this spectrum of resistance. And you can see in this image here that we've got a fully committed side of people, and that's probably the people that have signed on to be a part of this workshop today. You're already aware of what needs to happen. You're part of the crowd that is an early adopter. You're quite progressive in your thinking. You're going to have people at your club who are part of what we call the movable middle. So maybe they haven't really worked in this space before, they haven't heard about fair access, they're unconvinced, but they're curious and they're open to hear what you have to say. And once you've had that conversation with them about your reasons for why we want to encourage women, girls, and gender diverse people to participate more meaningfully at the club, they can be converted into someone who is an advocate for that change. And unfortunately, you will probably have people who are entrenched opposition and people who your energy and time is perhaps not best spent on. We want to focus our time and energy on the movable middle and consider that the entrenched opposition, depending on a range of different factors that are outside of your control, may never change their perspective on things like equity and inclusion. And there'll be a conversation there about whether those people are best suited to continuing their involvement at your sporting club. Thanks, Jackson. So this is a helpful little chart I find, which is just a sense of all the different ways that resistance and backlash can present itself, because there are lots of different types, and sometimes it can be quite subtle and quite insidious, and other times it can be more in your face, more aggressive, more easily identified as well. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that there is a spectrum, resistance being more passive on one end and backlash being a more aggressive, in your face, extreme version on the other end. And there's everything in between. So, you know, you might see people who give you something in the middle, a bit of appeasement to say, you know, yes, that they're trying to placate you. Yes, we do need to make a change. Yes, that will be nice one day, but they don't follow it up with any meaningful action. That's a very common one. And I won't go through all of these because we're all capable of reading them, but there's lots of different styles, and it's good to have a read through and see what you can identify perhaps in your experiences moving forwards. So a couple of tips from me. This isn't a golden solution, I'm afraid. You know, we all muddle our way through these confrontational situations where we need to respond to someone who is resisting change, but these are some tips that might be helpful to you to keep in mind. Don't be surprised because, again, it's a matter of when, not if. There will be resistance to propose changes that you'd like to put forward as part of your action planning. Do be willing to listen. Sometimes people, depending on their reason for resistance to change, just need to be heard. So we want to give people the same respect that we're encouraging them to display for us. Be willing to listen to their fears and really try to get to the bottom of what might be causing them to feel hesitant about the changes that you're suggesting. Frame the situation for them, not shaming them for their opinion that they hold. Remembering that people can hold a huge diverse range of different beliefs and attitudes depending on their lived experience, their cultural background, their religious experience, can be a range of different reasons. So it's not about shaming that person who maybe had a different opinion or attitude to you. but about framing it. And you can frame using examples, maybe using examples from your club or from a neighbouring club or from your own life or from an example of a friend, of where fair access to community sport has been a really positive, helpful change, rather than going in on the attack to the other person's beliefs. Use facts and evidence to support your response. There's no shortage. If you jump on the Office for Women in Sport website, the Sport and Recreation Victoria website, websites like Proud to Play or Pride in Sport, there's heaps of research that demonstrates that clubs really thrive when they meaningfully increase and support the participation of women, girls, and gender diverse people and the LGBTI community in sport. Use those research facts and data to your advantage when you're having these conversations, and be prepared with that asset in mind. And also celebrate success along the way. People love to celebrate success. This is hard work. It is cultural change is really, really hard work. It's so easy if you're someone who champions this at your club to become burnt out, to become emotionally fatigued and fed up. So you need to stop and celebrate success, even if they're very, very small wins. You know, maybe it's someone introducing themselves with their pronouns for their first time at a committee meeting, or getting an acknowledgement of country on the agenda. Even the small things, make sure you celebrate them, make sure you praise people, make sure you look after yourself in doing this work, because you need those small wins to keep you going, keep you fueled for the next challenge that comes up the next week. Okay, so time to put some money where our mouth is. This is an activity that might make you uncomfortable, get you thinking, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to mobilize our brains and get things working. So these are some common statements that we see in response to enacting actions that come from fair access policy. So the first one, our club is welcoming of everyone. Isn't that enough? Why do we specifically need to go out with this policy for women and girls? Or there are more men and boys at my club, so doesn't that mean that they need more access? So it's a statement around proportional access there, which is really interesting. Our men's team were here first, so why would we have to change things? And we can't have a women and girls team until our facilities are upgraded to being female friendly. This is probably the most common one that we get. You know, we don't have a change room for women and girls that's female friendly, or we don't have the right bathroom facilities, so we're not going to be able to get women and girls to play. What I'd like us to do, and we're near the end of our workshop, so you're holding on really well, and hopefully you're not too sick of my voice at this point in time. I'd love for you to pick one of these statements, 1, 2, 3, or 4, whichever one you feel most comfortable with, and think about how you would respond as a committee. If you received this in an email, what response would you give back in your email response? And try to keep it to just a sentence or two. If you can put in the chat the number that you're responding to, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and a sentence or two in how you might respond, let's see if we can share that knowledge around, and then maybe someone will answer one of the ones that you're maybe less comfortable with. I'll keep myself quiet for a few minutes, but I can see that Judith is straight out of the gates and typing away quickly, which is awesome. Ready and raring to respond. So completely fine if you're not sure how to tackle any of these statements. I will share that there are example responses which will be shared with you in the slides. But I think it's always great to have that communal sharing of ideas about what your club would do. We can have a look at each other's answers, and if there's any little pearls of wisdom, we can steal them for ourselves. There's no wrong answers here either. Couple more minutes to get your answers in for one of those statements, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Ah, and Judith has absolutely smashed it. What a fantastic response to number 2 there. Amazing. Perhaps we might need to think about why there are more men than women at our club and ask women in the community why they don't join. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Yep, yep. Our club is welcoming. Yep. So Joji's gone for number 1. Absolutely. Number 1's a really tricky one because one person's perception of what is welcoming might be different to another person's perception of what is welcoming. So it's really important to find some way to measure who's not in the room and why they might not be in the room. Yep, success of our club, absolutely. Yep, you can take a business modeling approach in your response to some of these as well. And, you know, if we're talking about such a significant proportion of the population, it doesn't make very good business sense to not offer a pathway to participation for such a significant chunk of the population. Definitely provides you with leverage to lobby for better facilities. It's not the main reason we want to be doing this, but it is absolutely part of the equation. Yep, agreed, Therese. Welcoming is a good start, but we also need to think about those barriers. And again, great that the people who are already here feel welcome, but who's not here and why are they not here? What might be stopping them from being a part of the club? Definitely. And Samantha shared with number 4. Yeah, fantastic. I also think it's worth noting with number 4 there, if it's a bit of a chicken and an egg conversation around female-friendly facilities. The fact of the matter is that it's often multi-million-dollar upgrades that are required to upgrade facilities to be appropriate for everyone. But most people are choosing their sporting club based on the culture and based on how participating makes them feel, not on how nice the toilet is. I know I've been part of some clubs that have had horrendous facilities, but at the end of the day, that's something you'll put up with if the culture is right. And then hopefully down the line, it is something that can be improved upon. But the fact of the matter is, and I understand the frustration of this as someone who has managed a club for a long time, is that, gosh, that funding is hard to secure. So we want to make sure we're not putting off that work while we're waiting for that opportunity to come up. Yeah, Sally, that's a great one as well. Fantastic. Just because something has been a certain way for a long time doesn't mean it's the best way to go forward. So challenging that perception of tradition that is so embedded into Australian sporting culture that we have to do it that way because we've always done it that way. I think that's something we really need to be aware of too. Amazing. Oh, loving these responses. We need to capture these and share them around, I think, so everyone's got them ready. We'll move on to the next slide, just mindful of time, Jackson. So we are almost at the end of our workshop here, but we'll leave you with a couple of bits and pieces, and I want to leave Jackson some time to talk about some Yarra specific opportunities that exist for you as well. But these are a number of the resources which have been utilised for this presentation. So if you do want to dig into anything more, please know that there is no shortage of research and data and information out there for you to share with your committee or to link to on your website or however you would like to utilise it, just for your own awareness and learning as well. The Safe and Inclusive Sport Guide, which is around preventing gender-based violence, is brand new, and that's been launched by Sport and Recreation Victoria this year. So definitely encourage you to check that one out if you haven't already. We'll go to the next slide as well. All right, and we've got our council contacts. I know it can be really frustrating working in local government. There can be a lot of turnover. Can be frustrating when you just need to be able to contact someone and you're not sure who's the right person to contact. So thank you, Jackson, for including everyone's details directly on this slide as well. I might hand over to you to maybe just to chat through briefly what each of these roles is responsible for, so people know who to contact for what.
Absolutely. Yes, as I sort of alluded to off the top, part of my portfolio is the seasonal club. So our traditionally cricket, football, soccer clubs, and then both Bridget and Frankie look after some of our leased and licensed clubs, so tennis, bowls, and we've got taekwondo, boxing clubs, and then Tass in our team as well, who's our sports administration officer, so he helps out with our bookings and does a lot of the admin work behind the scenes for our particular team. So yeah, that's the sort of small makeup of our team at the moment.
Thanks, Jackson. Do you have a question here from Joji, which I think is an excellent one, and it's around the template fair access principles and policy, which is provided by the Office for Women and Girls in Sport. And yes, that specifically states women and girls. And you'll notice in this presentation that I've included the LGBTI community and gender diverse people as well. When each council has adopted this policy, they've had the opportunity to update the template and include gender diverse people in it. And so through this education series, we are encouraging you to step aside from that binary view and take an intersectional approach in considering all people that might need equitable access to your sporting club. So including the gender diverse community, including transgender women as well. Unfortunately, that's not reflected in the template that's provided by the state government. So although it's not in there, consider it something that your club can absolutely do. And as I mentioned before, City of Yarra, you've got a fantastic reputation for your intersectional approach and inclusivity when it comes to sport and recreation participation. So I encourage you to continue on that path, even if it's not reflected in those materials.
No, definitely reflective in the way our policy has been set up as well. So yeah, definitely inclusive of the gender diverse population as well. I suppose just wanted to gloss over the opportunities that the club's thinking of initiatives and programs that may relate to women and girls or gender diverse people. There are a number of Yarra community grants that are out there. So I've just listed a few here that as the sort of top one alludes to, that targeting underrepresented populations. So I can send out some more information with the content as to when those submissions open and close, and our team's more than happy to discuss your ideas and programs to assist you with putting those submissions in.